This is Sonic Ventures, a podcast celebrating the concept album format with Robert Goebel and Joël Tibbetts.
Sonic Ventures is an evolving series of discussions that explore concept albums from a variety of artists and genres. Our intent here is to have celebratory conversations of our personal experiences with selected works and the issues and themes surrounding concept albums.
Sometimes, we will be treading familiar waters concerning music interpretation and creation. Other times, we will venture into different places of thought, emotion, and expression. We invite you to join us on our sonic venture.
This discussion was recorded Friday, December 8th, 2023. Hey guys, Rob here, and welcome to the Season 3 opening episode of the Sonic Ventures podcast. It was a real pleasure to get back from hiatus and sit in studio again with Joël for another musical discussion. There are few things in life that I look forward to as much as this. It's always a treat to dive into discussion after doing so much independent listening. Without question, each and every talk we have enriches my experience of the music. And of course, it also develops and evolves my friendship with Joël. Music is magical in the way that it can bring people together and allow them to share experiences that have a deep resonance within their lived lives. What I loved about this discussion was learning about Joël's history with this specific album, which you should know now from the title of the episode is Queensrÿche's 1988 album Operation Mindcrime. The contrast in our ages, with only a few years separating us, meant that we both experienced this album in some profoundly different ways as young people. I loved some of the talk about the form and structure of the album, and how we both understood the writing and recording process shaped the final product. Equally intriguing to me was the discussion of the contrasting sides, and the breakdown of the three-act structure, and Joël's thoughts that it could have maybe used a fourth act, something that would have fundamentally changed the album. Though it didn't really come up, I'm sure looking at Pink Floyd's The Wall in contrast would be illuminating here. And hearing Joël describe how amazing it was to see this performed live in its entirety, that made me wish I'd been around to catch the tour. His enthusiasm, even now for that experience, it's absolutely infectious. If you could have only seen how animated his face became as he talked about it. I was excited just listening and ready to go out and buy a t-shirt. Now we're dropping this episode a little late in the year than previous seasons, mostly because of some personal challenges that I've had to deal with this year, which included the discovery of some tumors on my thyroid and the need for surgery to get it completely removed. Although the surgery was a success, no more thyroid, ergo no more tumors, there was a complication, one of those minute worst-case scenario things, post-surgery basically, that required a critical surgical intervention. And it was the recovery from that took the wind out of my sails longer than originally anticipated. But I'm happy to report that I am well enough, and I'm going to be well going forward. And although they did find cancer in the thyroid, it was incidental and should be of little consequence for my future. But the whole ordeal definitely gave me pause to focus on what I value most in life. The love and support of my wife being the first, but also the love and support of friends and family, which of course includes Joël. I can't describe how much purpose and joy I get from building relationships with other human beings. And as Joël often likes to say, all of us sitting on this rock spinning around the sun. We're in this together. And then there's music. I can't imagine a life without it. And when you combine music in your life's journey, well, then you're living a musical life. And that's exactly what Sonic Venture is about. I marvel every day that shared journey we're on around the sun. And the fact that I'm doing it with some great friends and companions. And I've got a wicked stereo with some kick-ass tunes. Come on, how cool is that? Let's go to the episode.
Hello, Rob.
Hey, Joël. Welcome.
Yes, thank you. It's nice to be back in your studio again for another season of Sonic Ventures. This is season 3.
Season 3, episode 1.
Wow. I'm not sure if it feels longer or shorter than that. I guess I'm so accustomed to this in my life that the familiarity creates a nice neutrality of time.
Wow. I'm going to unpack that sentence later and look at it and do a little bit of a poetic analysis. That was lovely. I'm pretty sure it was quite profound.
Well, I'm awake, so...
Welcome. Yeah. I mean, are you awake?
Yes, I'm awake.
Very good.
So we're starting the season a little bit later than we have in the past. We usually had an episode out by October.
Yeah.
Usually.
We I think that our season 1, season 2, we sort of aimed end of September or end of October. End of October was our...
Yeah, because when we first started the whole thing, we did 3 episodes to get going. So when we launched, is different than season 2. But this season, we're like about 6 weeks, maybe 2 months behind what we had maybe dreamed of achieving.
Right.
But
2 months behind on our production schedule, owing a little bit to... life events from last season that sort of pushed the season a little later in the year. Lost my mom right at the end of spring there, beginning of summer. Mm-hmm. And I think I spoke about experiencing the phenomena of renoviction here in Vancouver and having to move at the same time.
Yeah, we did talk about that as well.
Yeah. And then, of course, I've had a few health-related issues that... reared up that required some surgery in September. That is a story unto itself. I mean, if we had the time, we could get into all the detail, and who knows, maybe we'll open that up a little bit more in the aftercast. But the good news is the surgery I had, thyroid surgery, thyroid removal. Long story short, here I am. Thyroid's not. So that's good. It would be
that's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, I'm here, but my thyroid is not here, and I won because that's the way that works. But yeah, so so that's really the long and the short of it. A couple of months of recovery. Voice gets pretty shredded, and different things obviously happened as part of that whole process. And but very happy to have the love and support of my family, all my friends, and even some of our listeners, and that people that were very generous and kind to reach out and share their best wishes and concerns for me. So thanks to everyone.
Well, for me again, it's very nice to be able to keep doing this with you, because honestly, I wouldn't. But I really have to say that I'm moved and admire how you have navigated all of this. And so I feel very honored if I've played anything but a small, minute role in helping along with that. But I tip my hat to you, man. Like you've really kept the sails open and kept your eyes on the horizon and keep moving forward, and I deeply respect that. And like
thanks,
I said,
man.
I really admire it. So it makes this the beginning of the season even sweeter, because we talked a little bit about what was going on for you in the previous season, but it's really amazing to me whenever I have people in my life who look at life in such a nuanced way like you do. So you just, like you said at one point, you got to keep in a few different ways. I can't remember exactly how you put it, but just the idea of this stuff that we do creatively in our lives is not kind of tacked on.
Right.
It is our part of our lives, and it factors into it. And so, again, I felt very blessed to have this time creatively with you, because I've learned stuff from this myself. Of course, I didn't go through what you went through, but that's one of the benefits of having creative relationships, is how much you learn. And all the stuff that the biggest takeaways I've had from a lot of my creative projects have been whenever stuff doesn't go smoothly.
Yeah.
Right? There's that expression that how good a business is when it's going through hard times, not when it goes through easy times. So again, very nice to be here with you again in your space, and hearing your voice as though it has not been affected at all, which is great as well. Although I did imagine, what would that be like if your voice was a little bit different? Would we have to change the...
Yeah, we might have needed new mics, and certainly maybe different kind of EQ.
We have to use auto-tuner, maybe.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, or just pipe
correction
through AI. We'll take the transcript and
no, but
and
your
around.
voice sounds great, and like I said, it's great to hear it, and to be doing this again with you.
Thank you. Yeah, my pleasure, and again from me, thank you for your love and support through this as well. Because having friends and people that care about you is one of the things that give you that nodal point on the horizon to sort of fix to, and the comfort of knowing that your ship is sailing somewhere.
Right.
And so it's a wonderful thing to have that. So very, very, very much appreciated and very much felt by me. So I definitely felt that. So thank you.
So speaking of friendship,
yes,
this is a very sarcastic segue.
Okay.
But today's album,
yes,
has a very interesting tone that I guess you could say is at times seemingly to be the inverse of friendship. So today we're talking about Queensrÿche's Operation Mindcrime.
Right. That is our, I guess, our season 3, episode 1 album, Operation Mindcrime by Queensrÿche.
Yeah.
And we've, like last year and the year before, we've both been sort of immersed in listening over the past couple of months, combined with our listens, collective listens over the course of our lifetime. So our histories with this music isn't just, the time that we've spent recently listening to it. It's it's an ongoing conversation or an ongoing experience.
This album was on the first concept album list for the show,
right?
For the podcast.
Yeah,
it was definitely one of the ones that immediately jumped up into my mind.
Yeah, it had that cultural, that the memory of it had that cultural resonance that that you just couldn't shake it.
No,
when you thought concept albums.
No, and I have to say that my listening of this album this time really stands out from all the other albums that we've talked about so far.
Wow.
Yeah, it really surprised me, actually.
Okay.
In a big way. So you might notice that I don't have my notebook out.
Right. Okay, that's true. I think that's the first time I've not seen you with papers in front of you.
Yeah. And there's a very particular reason for that.
Sure.
Which for sure I want to get into. But as we usually do, we start talking about our first experience of this album.
Right.
So for me, it started with Much Music. And I believe it was the Power Hour.
Yeah.
I think it was the first time that I saw a video for this album. And I had no knowledge of Queensrÿche at all up until that moment. And the video was for Eyes of a Stranger. And I very clearly remember seeing it right from the beginning. They introduced the song, and the video started. And the moment I started watching it, I knew from all the imagery that was in the video that there was way more to this song. It was a part of something bigger. And I was totally blown away by the song.
Right.
I couldn't believe what it was. It was just actually, there's an interesting connect with Queensrÿche with this album. It was the same thing like when we talked about Gretchen Goes to Nebraska. I was just blown away by what I was hearing and what I was seeing. And so I watched the video, and within a few days, I went to A&B Sound. You know, remember when we used to go out and buy records and, and tapes and things and CDs? And I went out and I got a copy of the album, and I listened to that album every day for months. Now, I had a very wide palette at a young age. I've talked about it a little bit.
Right, and let's just pin that in time. So this is 1988.
Oh, thank you, yes.
Right, and so you would have been in
15.
junior high.
That's
just
right.
so grade 9, grade 10, just in that kind of straddle era, right?
I think all those are straddle era.
Yeah.
Grade 8, grade 9, grade 10.
Somewhere in that.
Yeah, it was 88, thank you.
Yeah.
And I would have been 15. And I was also like about 2 years into playing guitar.
Right, okay. So
I was very much in guitar mind at this point. Very into a number of players.
And was metal your genre? If you had to choose one to sort of represent you at that point?
Well, are you talking about for the guitar, or are you talking about in general?
In general, like
I had
whose T-shirt were you wearing?
Well, that's a good question. I was actually wearing a few of them.
Okay.
But I basically kind of kept, I was in a band. We played Rush and Yes. So there was a little bit of a stratification there. And I had a couple other friends that were into metal, Metallica, Anthrax, things like that. So that was more my public face.
Yeah.
But then there was the classical and the jazz was
Right.
on my own at home. Japanese traditional music or Indian traditional music, all of that was kept under wraps.
Okay, yeah.
But that my face to my peers was that it was more hard rock, right? And I was all into the guitar gods of the day. So thank you for putting a little more context to this. So yeah, I was about 15, very very guitar rock minded. But as I said, I was also very much into fusion and jazz too. So, the whole Alan Holdsworth thing and Frank Gambale and that.
Right.
But for my friends, it was really that kind of prog rock, hard rock area.
Yeah.
So Queensrÿche is perfect. It just fits right in the slot.
Yeah.
So I went out and got the album, listened to it for months, and was a very devout listener of this album.
Cassettes?
Yeah, I never bought it on vinyl.
Okay.
I bought it on cassette because I had a Walkman. And I walked around with music all the time. So it had to be on cassette.
You were one of those guys.
Well, yes.
Yeah. No judgment. No judgment. I'm just trying to picture you.
I'm right here.
Yeah. and you're wearing headphones, so there you go.
Which I did all the time. Yeah. No, it's a good question. I was very utilitarian. I've always been very utilitarian about how I carry music around. So I didn't have oh, that's nice. Ladies and gentlemen, the first time ever on the Sonic Ventures podcast, the fizz of Coke.
The fizzy drink. Coke Zero.
Yeah, yes, Coke Zero. That was not paid for. So I was always very utilitarian about music. I had to be able to take it with me. Mm-hmm. So I'd always buy cassettes, which this album has an amazing cassette story that I'll tell later.
Okay.
It's amazing, but I won't come to that yet. So basically I listened to this album devoutly along with a bunch of other things, but it was in my serious rotation for all of my high school life. I listened to this album thousands of times. And so that was my first experience of listening to it. Nobody kind of put it in front of me. You know, like at school, you'd have friends that say, oh, you have to hear this, you have to hear that.
Right.
It was all on my own. It was just like Queensrÿche, exactly the same. And none of my friends were into it the way that I was. Nobody. They would acknowledge it. They would say, oh, that's cool. But it hit a real important sweet spot for me. And it was primarily because of the fact of the concept, the scale of it, the whole album. And that was my first experience with this album. What about you?
Yeah, for me, my history with this album is very different. In 1988, I was in my second year of university. So I graduated in 87.
Right.
So I'd either just finished or was going into my second year. And where my musical interests lie, had this album come out in 1986,
Right.
my story would have been very similar to yours, or 1985, say.
Right.
It would have been the same story.
Yeah.
Except I didn't have a Walkman for a long time.
Okay.
But I finally got one. So it's all right.
Okay.
Everything worked out in the end. It would have been the same story. But by the time 1988 came around, my interests in music, I was already sort of, I'm going to say, the hairband fatigue had set in. And that's not because I listened to hair metal. Even though I looked like a hair metal guy, long hair, and I played guitar, and I liked, hard rock and metal. What I didn't, the whole Poison, Warrant, Cherry Pie thing, that whole LA sort of glam hair metal scene, was just becoming absurdist to me in the sense.
Well, and we're in the same place with that, because that was never a place I went to.
But for me, that at that point in time, my interests suddenly changed when I heard Jane's Addiction.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Yeah, I see.
And Soundgarden.
Right.
Early Soundgarden. So suddenly my interest was grabbed by some sort of more authentic musical experience in my mind, alt rock. Being part of that. And Queensrÿche, interesting band, because of course, with alt rock and the sort of led into the birth of grunge in sort of the 90s, early 90s. Queensrÿche, being a Seattle band, has tendrils and tentacles into the scenes that, say, produced an early Soundgarden, or produced
Alice in
Chains, and Mother Love Bone had more roots into glam and we'll call it LA style kind of like metal with the sort of Van Halen crossover,
right?
In a way, early Alice in Chains did, but with a little twist. And Queensrÿche kind of existed in that realm a little bit, except they started a little earlier. So they're in the same way our stories are a little different. Where Queensrÿche kind of their connection to the Seattle scene comes from earlier origin within the scene. So still heavily influenced by we'll call it LA.
Oh yeah, very much so.
So long story short, for me, I had not been a great fan of Queensrÿche up until that point.
Right.
There was one video until this album that used to get played on the Power Hour, as which was the Much Music Canadian version of MTV. They relegated us either 30 minutes or an hour, depending upon the era of metal.
It started at 30.
Yeah.
And then they jacked it up to an hour.
Yeah, boy, we got it. Yeah. So you'd wait a whole week for the Power Hour.
On a Thursday, usually,
Thursday
wasn't
evening,
it?
so you could
like
watch
7 or 6 or something like that?
Something like that. And you could watch 60 minutes of metal, of which anything with that tagline metal attached to it was in there.
Which was actually great.
Look, in retrospect, it was great looking back on that. At the time, having to wait for a Poison video to play, or a band that you were embarrassed to call metal or to bring into the tribe.
That was a complicating factor, but where else were you going to see Celtic Frost?
Well, Celtic Frost or Merciful Fate, or like anybody, or Voivod, or
Voivod. Yeah, like
good stuff. Yeah, or Venom.
Yeah, Venom. I was just thinking of Venom.
That's who. Yeah, those early Venom videos are like scary stuff.
But you're right. The ambiguity had those things you might have to wait through. But then it also meant that they were just putting out anything to see what would happen.
Whoever.
So you could get access to things you wouldn't normally get.
And it's surprising because a lot of metal videos were a little late to the party. Right.
Yeah.
And when you got them, they were more often performance videos than they were actual conceptual videos.
They were also trying to figure out, how do we do this?
Yeah.
How do we present bands?
Yeah.
And you're right. The performance part weighed heavier.
Right.
Because it was what they already did.
Sure.
And it probably yielded much cheaper production costs.
Sure.
Yeah. So it was a big part. The whole Power 30.
Yeah,
part of my
there's
high school years.
I think there's probably a podcast just to sit down and talk about that and work that out after we work out a couple of theses and write some papers on it. But the video that Queensrÿche had was for a song called the Warning or Warning,
right? And
it was a live video, and Jeff Tate had this really bizarre short haircut at the time, and just.
They had the kind of that glammy look about them.
Yeah, but they were kind of half and half. They were like a foot in glam, but not glammed up.
Yeah.
And a foot in wanting to be Saxon or something, not quite.
And then they did that cover of that tune, "Want to Get Close to You" by, what was it, Dalbello?
Oh, maybe. I don't even remember.
And that was the only other way that I knew who they were. Yeah. And it was very weird that a Canadian band was covered by this American metal band.
Huh.
And that was about all I knew. But for you then, how did the Operation Mindcrime get into your ears?
The name first. So I was first familiar with the fact that there was such a thing.
Okay.
From guitar mags. Just little but
they got
never
a lot of press.
But their press for Mindcrime came after the follow-up, came after Empire, right? Because what happened was Mindcrime.
You're right.
Mindcrime took a while, and to catch on, and at some point, by it again, sort of reconstructing the past, they dropped the video fairly late into its life cycle initially, that then gave it new life, right? And probably the video you referenced, but. It was really after when Empire, the follow-up album was released, and the song that people still sort of associate with them, Silent Lucidity, just made such a big cultural splash that Mindcrime got sort of revisited. Yeah. And even for me at that time period, I always thought Silent Lucidity was on Operation Mindcrime because I wasn't familiar with the album as a piece.
Yeah.
I was, so I just assumed I was late to the party, and it didn't occur to me that I was like an album late to the party.
But honestly, for me, I felt like I was the only one at the party.
You might have been.
Really, I didn't have the same kind of fervor happening in me for it. In my friends around me.
Yeah, I don't remember people getting excited about them. And so I I was a pretentious, precocious, and elitist musical snob at the time. Not today, of course. But I'd probably written them off already.
And I can see that because as we go on, I have some things that I've gone through with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my initial experience, long story short, again, probably long story long, is that I sort of missed that, from 1988 to maybe 1991, I didn't really pay them any mind.
Yeah. So the landscape would be very different by then. Very different.
Exactly. But Silent Lucidity, when that came out and that was getting its heavy play, there was something undeniable there that caused more of a retrospect.
And that was so surreal for me because even my girlfriend at the time, who had no interest in hard rock pretty much at all, although I have to say over the years, she did start to like Tom Sawyer. She loved that song. It was that time was so surreal for me where suddenly everyone around me was like, oh, Queensrÿche's great. And nobody knows about Operation Mindcrime.
Right.
was so weird.
Yeah.
It's very odd.
Well, I can only imagine that the experience of having this concept album in your heart that you've built a relationship with.
Oh, yeah.
For a couple of years running.
Oh, man.
That nobody knows about. Like how amazing is that to have that?
Well, it is amazing. And that's part of the reason why I don't have notes.
Yeah.
And I have no doubt that we're going to get into the why this, the things about this album particularly.
Yeah.
But for me, I have not listened to this album in 20 years.
At all.
I haven't listened to it. No, yeah, that's right. At all. At all. I haven't listened to it at all. So what happened for me when we decided that we would do this album, I put it on and I was immediately just jettisoned into 15 years old emotionally. And I don't mean any particular memory, and I don't mean any particular emotion. I mean like the powder keg of being 15 years old and the emotions of it. I had no idea that this album had that relationship for me.
Wow.
No idea. It has nothing to do with the concepts. It has nothing to do with anything in particular except with, I think, the timing of it and what I emotionally injected into that album that I didn't know I was doing as a kid. So for the first week of listening to this album, I was 15 years old. Emotional. It was amazing. It was incredible. So you know how in the album at the beginning there's dialogue and our protagonist says, "I remember now."
Yeah.
It was exactly that, but it was only like, I guess the best analogy I have right now is that it's just stepping into a body of water I haven't been in for a long time.
Wow.
And just being in it. So I couldn't think about this album to talk about it. But every time I put it on, I was 15 years old and I got to learn everything I can to play my guitar incredibly well. I have to get here or get there. I have to be open to this feeling and that feeling. Like, it was just so hard to not be emotionally overtaken by the album. It was so hard that I just had to yield to it. So for the first week, I was just there. And it's interesting too, because I actually live where I grew up when I was 15. So that just kind of compacts that a little bit more. But it was so wonderfully thrilling.
Wow.
Like, really, it was that thing of, I didn't feel bad about it. I didn't feel good about it. I just felt it. And it was so invigorating. And it was so wonderful to really actually try to find memories that this was for, and there were none. It was the music. The music was the memory. But the feeling of the emotions was far more nuanced than any particular aspect of the music.
Right. So that familiarity had somehow bonded with some very early emotional states of being and emotional experiences that was all sort of activated for you on the listening.
Oh, it completely took me by surprise.
Really? You were surprised
I
by
had
it?
no idea Because after that first week, I even started to think, when was the last time I heard this? And I thought about, well, maybe it was when Operation Mindcrime Part 2 came out, which I remember not enjoying, but I thought it was great that Dio was on it. I thought that was amazing. But the music, it didn't, like, it was like, it just didn't fit together. And then I remembered that how when I listened to the new one, I had no desire to listen to the first one. And then I remembered why. So here we go to the part about the timing.
Right.
So by the time I finished high school, I think that I had... this album had done its thing for me, whatever that was. And then by that time, the whole... Empire album and Silent Lucidity came out, and they had a tour. And I had to go to the show because they did all of Operation Mindcrime in the second part of the show.
Right, in its entirety.
Right. And it was awesome. It was exactly what I wanted. And by then I was in a completely different musical headspace. I invested myself in the album Empire, but within a few months, it's not Operation Mindcrime.
Right.
And it's not a fair comparison in terms of what I've just illustrated, because emotionally, it was huge for me. But also musically and conceptually, to me, it was like, you can't compare these two albums.
Right.
One hit song is not Operation Mindcrime. It's a lot more for me than that. But I saw that show, and then I was done. It was like everything had been put in nice. It was my graduation.
Nice.
It was a nice little bow, and I'm done.
Yeah.
I'm done with this. But it wasn't completely fully conscious.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I just never listened to it.
Well, there's that expression where they talk about, growing older and putting your childhood toys away.
Yeah.
Whatever that exact expression
But you don't.
is. Right. You
On
don't.
a number of levels.
Yeah. But there is something in the process that you might hide them from yourself for a bit, or you might deny them. Right. There's sometimes we deny those things that we cherished as young people because we're trying to differentiate who we are now with our perception of ourself back then.
Right. Those talismans have served their purpose. Yeah. And actually, in many instances, I think when you do what you've just described, you're actually preserving them in a way that you're not aware of.
Yeah. Which
is what I would say has kind of happened for me. Because, man, by the time I get to the third track on this album, I've got, I'm immortal. That 15-year-old, you can stay up all night, get up early in the morning, and still survive the day.
Yeah.
It was like there was a fountain of youth quality to this experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what you've said is very nice and very useful in this idea of putting away childhood things.
Yeah.
Because that putting away can be easily misinterpreted as away.
Yeah.
Like they're gone. And so I think that like Jamu has, if those of you who don't know, check out Morning Coffee Vinyl Side and Jamu. And there's a very nice similarity, I think, or there's a nice connection in what we're talking about. But hearing this album now, though, and going through that first week, after I did that, I was able to then access other things of me now.
Right, you were able to bridge the gap between your 15-year-old self and your present-day adult self, and supposedly, and then the history and the totality of your experiences from the point of 15 up to now.
Plus, I've also coordinated the center of the universe and figured out all quantum mechanics.
Very good. And just, you got to start somewhere, right? So I think that's pretty good for an October, really, and a November. Well done.
Thank you. So then, now that we've dealt with my emotional stuff, where are you with this album?
Where am I with it?
Where are you? What do you think of the album?
Yeah, well, so that's great. That's a great question. So, my approach to this, I kind of had to reconcile the fact that I knew I had a sort of a prejudicial avoidance up until. Not up until now, but back in the day, with this, and so that
which you've addressed very well.
That I'm going to have to make sure that I wasn't certain. I wasn't certain if I was going to be able to listen to this and enjoy it. I didn't know what kind of prejudice I was going to bring into it. With my own 18-year-old self or 19-year-old self was going to. Maybe I'd be too cool for school, right? Sort of, and bring that to it. I don't know. I didn't know. And so I stripped that aside and, the initial listens on first listens, because there's not anything here I haven't heard before.
Yeah.
This album, there's a lot. This album is not subtle in any way. So when it comes on and you listen through, and again, my process in these is to almost always listen to the full album at a go, with some exceptions, and there's some on this album specific that I'll talk about later. But generally, you sit down and I'm committed to this, and so that's a lot to take in. So initially a lot of trying to orientate within the onslaught of volume and intensity and what the theatrics, everything that's going on with it. And usually it takes me a few listens to start to my brain is starting to sort of put nodal points on little moments and things, and starting to organize for me, so that orientate myself within the sound of it, and within the sort of the progression of it, and that it took probably about 5 listens to where suddenly I was like anticipating the melodies. And sort of working with and that would have come much quicker had I been younger. And in the same way kids apparently learn quick, and fast. And I think when they
take things in fast.
Take things in fast.
I don't know what the learning. I think that can be argued.
Right. Good point.
2 + 2 = 4. Why? Because it does. Oh, all right.
Yeah, they have to They have to learn orientation very quickly, because otherwise little kids will get squished.
Fair enough.
Right. Yeah. So, once I kind of got acclimatized to it and found my way with it, it was a wonderful experience. Pursuing this album. The experience wasn't so dissimilar to my experience with listening to the Seventh Son of a Seventh Son.
Oh, there's a very strong connect. Yeah.
Right. In the same way that my maiden exposure and my, the stuff that I was the albums before that. Right. And so I had less familiarity with Seventh Son. And so I had to do the same sort of thing to take it in as a whole. And so there were some parallels there in that, but rather quickly established itself as something that I began to anticipate and began to look forward to. So, when you listen to an album, that's an album, and you do make that sort of commitment in time and space to listen to the whole thing. I mean, there's a lot to take in there. That commitment itself is not some insignificant commitment. It can be. But it can be something so much more than that. So it's no small thing to sit down and say, I'm going to listen to this album, and then listen to the album.
Well, I think one of the images that's coming to mind for me right now is like archaeology, where people just say, well, you just dig it up out of the ground. Well, no, you actually have to carefully and mindfully see what's there. So the process you just described for me, I think, is very, very important, because you're talking about a commitment of time and your attention, where you are taking out big chunks of earth, but then eventually you got to go at it with a brush, and then just kind of dust it off. If you're really going to say that, okay, I've looked into this and I've carefully removed or found things in there,
right,
so that they can be looked at with some degree of attention and what's the word I'm looking for? Validity.
Right.
You know, you don't just drive over and say, well, I'm sure there's something in there, and then you go away. You actually have to go in and very mindfully examine it, which is, I think, what you've kind of outlined.
Yeah. Well, and also, like, if you parallel with something like taste, right? And you're tasting something that is new, or, like, you know, for lack of a better term, exotic, right? Which is a problematic term.
Yes, very much so. But I think I get where you're getting at.
So you would be wrong to say give a little kid a big block of Stilton cheese and have him, like, just grab the biggest bite. You know, like, that's not going to work. Even as an adult, if you've never had Stilton cheese before, the first time you have it, you don't take the biggest bite on the plate. You know, you go at it a little easy, right? You sort of ease into it, because, again, the last thing you want to do is write off the experience of it because you had a big bite and your body sort of didn't process it in the moment.
Right, so, because you're also talking about your own problem solving.
Right, and you're trying to understand what is this flavor? What am I eating? What am I doing? And it's the same thing with music. So, like, the first time for me, it wouldn't have been good to just crank up the stereo on full blast and sit in front of the speaker and just, like, this is it, like, right. I obviously I played it at volume and had to listen to it, but I gave it my attention, and I had to kind of work into it, and I had to, and knowing that
what have you retrieved from the earth?
You just want my hot take? No.
I love to hear about your process.
Yeah. Well, no, this album really, really grew on me. And in particular, and we can talk, we'll definitely break down some stuff and talk about stuff. The first half of the album was, leading up into the sort of the end of the second act, we'll call it.
Very much so.
Very, very, very strong, and very, very strong arc that I experienced, that I began to really anticipate, sort of traveling through that arc while enjoying those momentary, we'll call it the steps of that journey. So each song or each passage or movement through that arc being something I could anticipate at the same time. So this sort of simultaneous arc and individual thing. And then as I kind of round out into the end of the album, the last few songs, to me, sort of the third act of the album has less interest to me. It just for reasons.
It's always the hardest one.
Yeah,
it's the hardest one to do. As they say, is the third act.
Yeah,
we've talked about that.
We have, and it happened here for some interesting reasons, and I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah.
I really, really loved it. Through and through. A couple of criticisms, obviously, about certain things that I was a little less impressed with, but on the overall, not only did I have to really rewrite how I understood this band in the sort of history of my musical journey, but just the cultural journey that they were on and their place in culture that I missed. I'm so pleased to have had this experience, because there are some amazing moments on this album that are a wonder, and that are exciting and thrilling and mind-bending And, there's some great adjectives that come in there. It's a great journey. It's a great trip. And it traverses through lots of little areas of interest, both musically and we'll call it culturally and historically. And that intersects with some of our other musical journeys.
Yeah, I thought that too.
That really sort of legitimizes this in some ways too, because it although we often sort of experience these things, I don't want to say sort of in isolation, but
you mean the albums?
Yeah. Like we are, because of our focus, which can be myopic, right? That these albums are part of a larger intersection of musical connections,
right.
That
well, I was definitely thinking about Seventh Son, Gretchen Goes to Nebraska, Dark Side of the Moon, mainly because those are rock albums, concept albums. But the thing that was interesting for me once I got through that emotional trip and looking at the album at how it is and how it's put together, I could really see why, for me, it met so many points.
Yeah.
Because the conceptual piece, the ideas that were in there, I had already read 1984 2 or 3 times by then. So there was a huge familiarity in a concept like that with, mind crime or thought crime that George Orwell uses in 1984. But one of the things of listening to it now that I found very compelling was what you said about it moves so well in the first half. And actually that was how it was laid out, is when you get to Sweet Sister Mary, which is halfway through the album, that was when you would turn over the vinyl. That was when you'd flip the cassette. And the movement, not only of musically, but the story.
Yeah.
And then also the tempos and the material, and then the sound effects and the actors that they had doing little roles here and there. They did such a good job. It moves like it's a comic book page turner. It just, the tiles fit so well together in that first part.
Yeah.
That I was actually surprised at how that really stuck out for me. And the image I had was that I think there's 5 tracks before that last one, Sweet Sister Mary, of what would have been the first side. Sweet Sister Mary is is kind of like a ballad, sort of semi kind of ballad feel, and it's got Michael Kamen's orchestrations and vocal work in it, which is a big part of why Silent Lucidity was what it was.
Yeah.
Was his addition to that, and he needs to be mentioned for this album for sure.
Yeah.
Is that they made this very strong current of a sonic and a conceptual narrative that when it gets to that song, it's like it pools very well. It slows down incredibly well. And you just get put into, I'm mentioning bodies of water a lot today, you get into this very larger space, not only in terms of the ideas that are going on, because you're getting into the love piece that's in the story. You're getting into the complexity of the issues that seem to be presented so simply at first, in terms of what the protagonist is going through, his political views. It becomes much more personal. It gets a lot more complicated. But then there's also the vocal writing for the choir is got a much larger palette than them just singing oohs and ahs.
Right.
They're doing Latin mass text.
Yeah.
They're doing different vocal techniques. Even the strings, particularly the cellos, end up doing extended techniques.
Yeah.
And the pizzicatos at the end, which Michael Kamen would have probably been the one who wrote.
Yeah.
So there is such a richness that you end up at the end of that second act, that the first side of this album, let's call it a side because it would have been back in the day, is exceptionally strong.
Right. And part of the way I've conceived of that, initially I was almost going to be more critical of that division. You know, the first side of this album is narrative, right? It's the story. The second side of this album is the reflection.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So,
largely.
Yeah.
Largely.
It's the narrative. It doesn't so much unfold as well. You can look at that in the first half. You know, he's going into memory to re-experience the story.
Yes.
He emerges from it at the midpoint. And now he's in reflective mode on the story he's just revealed.
Right.
And experiencing his experience through reflection.
Yeah.
So there's still a continuation.
Right.
It just the mechanics of it are different, and the mood and the timbers and the structure of how that is done is different as well. And so, you know, depending upon different things. I talked about listening to the album in its entirety.
Right.
Well, as we progress through the seasons, you know, there are definitely albums that are informed by the vinyl limitations of time on vinyl.
Yeah.
And cassette. And we're approaching CD era here.
Yes.
And run times are longer.
Yeah.
And you may have 35 minutes or 40 minutes of time to listen to an album. Do you got an hour and 5 minutes of time?
I did.
Yeah. Do you got an hour and 10 minutes time? You know, like you're depending upon how you listen to these things, you just may not physically have the time, you know, to get through a complete listen to the end. And so I found myself, as much as I tried not to, playing the narrative side more, right? Like getting 30, 40 minutes, 45 minutes into, and so my accumulated time with the album, I always started it at the beginning,
right?
Weighed more heavy on the front end.
Which makes sense. I think that it's just I think it's a reasonable factor of you know, the arrow of time that we're so weighted by.
Well, and it's an interesting element to the way we all now experience concept albums, and the way we did, and the way we will, and now with we'll call it the CD paradigm. Having been broken, you know, we're already seeing streaming albums sort of going back to more limited time albums, you know, 8-song, 9-song albums. Again, because they're not informed by the need to fill up a CD because you can, right? And so there's something, I think, in the natural rhythms, whether it's a learned rhythm or there's some sort of natural rhythm of time and commitment to a musical experience.
Well, I mean, then there's also the you've gone into a very open area of discussion around the relationship between the technological realities of the time and then the business realities, the creative realities. Because when this album's conception came from one person, it was Jeff Tate, and he was inspired by two things. One was getting to know people who are a part of the separatist movement in Quebec, which is that could be a podcast of its own. There's a lot to that. So for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, Quebec is a province in Canada, and I know I'm not going to say this right for everybody because there's a lot of different views that go into it, but it's largely the French community that was established there after the British and the French fought. And the Brits basically said, okay, you've lost, but you can stay. And there has been a lingering animosity as far as I've come to know it, because my parents are from back out east. So I have my own personal stories with that. So I'm telling a very narrow story on purpose for time.
Right.
But there was a movement of individuals in Quebec who felt that Quebec should be its own country with its own laws, its own rules, its own governance. And they were known as separatists, and they at one point did terrorist things. They blew stuff up and they engaged in violent behavior. And so apparently, as far as I've learned, Jeff Tate knew a couple of people who were a part of that movement, and he was interested in that as far as I can tell.
Sure.
And then he also had some friends who had issues with drugs. And so he conceived of this story that brought both of those elements together. And the band was resistant to this concept apparently at first. And he had to kind of work them into maybe doing this as the possibility of doing this. And when I read about that, I thought how interesting it was, because the actual thing that got Jeff Tate singing was 2112.
Yeah.
That's how I actually discovered he could sing the way that he does, was emulating Geddy Lee. But also that he was suggesting something that a band for where they were seemed a lot bigger to take on.
Yeah.
They still, as far as I could tell in what I read, they still were looking for what they were about. They had a number of member changes. Jeff Tate wasn't even really in the band at some point. And so for them to not only say, okay, we're going to do a concept album, but in doing that, they actually, as far as I'm concerned, they found their sound. And there are some people who feel that they actually initiated probably one of the strongest influences of prog metal, where you get kind of the Dream Theater, let's say, style or form of prog that's heavier and it's complex, and so this actual album is not only, I think, got a historical significance for its influence in prog metal, which brings us, to Degent and Meshuggah and that.
Sure.
But I think that for the band themselves, it was a huge undertaking. Even I was like, you were talking about technical playtime. What about the label saying, okay, we'll do this?
Right. And that goes back to why my interest in them was not very high. But before this album came out, because, I had heard these guys, right? We had heard them. And
Queen of the Reich.
Yeah, and they were, there's a line in the movie Knight's Tale where the guy says, you've been measured and found wanting. Like we'd heard them and they were nothing special. They were derivative. They were a little obvious in their imagery and they were wearing clothes that we'll call didn't fit them. And what
it was like early Rush. Come on.
Hold on.
Now, come on. Now take a moment and remember the picture on Fly By Night.
First, let's all relax. Those kimonos are sacred. Those are sacred things. Those are robes of a religious import. There's things I could say that I cannot say right now.
Yeah, but here you have a band for all of that who has a drummer who's got Pert's chops.
Yeah, like the point I'm trying to make is they hadn't. You were right in saying that they didn't know what they were yet. They hadn't found that, and their own identity had not congealed into something. And this opportunity, I think, was such that that vacuum, it created a vacuum that just pulled them into the opportunity, that for whatever reason they were able to collectively recognize and get behind, and produce this album and actually achieve an identity, right? Yeah. But otherwise, had they not done this album, I think they would have fallen right off the cliff.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I remember reading in a Guitar Magazine interview with them how they said that they never do cover tunes or jam. They, for my memory of it, which I'm sure is clouded, they didn't have a band situation where do we play covers or do we play originals? They were only ever about originals, and they had to work out what they were going to do. And so I'm sure that they all could play covers of other things, or they had familiarity with other music, but unto themselves, they weren't working off of, I don't think they were working off of any band as a blueprint. They kind of came together as in this ambiguity of what are we about and what are we doing. And so I just feel that the identity that they present on Operation Mindcrime, like Jeff Tate singing, you would think they had done 3 albums before this. He's so committed. He's so behind it. It's just the way King's X, Gretchen Goes to Nebraska, was described by some reviewers as having very strong performances. Right. This album has such strong performances on it.
Yeah. And you're right to sort of, you're right to point out his commitment to these vocals at the same time. Like, without question, Jeff is an exceptional vocal talent, and he was doing something vocally that very few people could do, and certainly very few people were doing. Like, you might you might find a couple of female singers that might have been doing similar stuff back around that time, or at least were capable of it. Maybe somebody like Halford, Well,
I think that there's like a Robert Plant, Rob Halford, Geddy Lee influence.
Yeah,
there.
but not. I'm also more thinking like sort of the big sort of commitment to that style, that like that full-throated commitment.
And the range?
To sing in that, just to sing in that range, and to sing in that sort of pseudo-operatic style, right?
Well, and that's one of the things that I think I was thinking at one point listening to this, is that I wonder if they found their style because they just decided to pretend to be an orchestra. Because the way that this music is put together, the guitar parts and the planning of the pieces, it feels very orchestral or symphonic.
Well, I mean, it absolutely is, right? I mean,
well, I wouldn't say it absolutely is, because there's no orchestra except for a small. But I mean, like.
Well, I think that the parts are orchestrated. I mean, whether we call this an opera or a rock opera. Or we call it a symphony. I mean, there's it's got elements of all that in it. Yes. And but for non-traditional orchestration, this is a big piece. And you as a composer in particular, I'd be interested in just how structurally similar you see this in terms of a symphonic layout or an operatic layout.
I actually very comfortably and precariously would draw the connection to opera.
Yeah.
It's very, very much a rock opera in my mind.
Yeah.
And just how you were saying how, the third act doesn't quite work. A lot of
Most operas
don't work.
Yeah.
We got to get out of this now.
Yeah.
And usually though, the older librettos I've found, this is my personal opinion, they're so convoluted to begin with.
Yeah.
To create a context. This album, I think, is worthy of study if you are thinking about not only creating a concept album, but just about how to present things and pace them. The only, we talked about the third act, which would be the second side of the album. I have to say that the weakest point for me in this album is that first track, The Needle Lies.
You mean the Iron Maiden song?
The reason why I would say that it's the weakest track is because of the tempo and the feel.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the other tracks after would actually come across as being stronger. And I think that
in contrast, or just
no, like it would actually make those songs have greater.
Oh, okay.
They would make the whole side stronger, because I'd also argue that that last act actually needs to be more like Beethoven and have a kind of fourth movement. This story is so complicated. See, what's great about this story to begin with is it does what Twin Peaks did, is it presents you with surface that's very digestible.
Okay.
And that is very easily, you can follow it very easily, but then it's suggesting that, this could get really deep and really dark.
Right.
So this album would never have been made if I was producing it, because I would have argued that it should be a double album because of, not only because of the actual world that they've built,
but you want four acts.
I want four acts because the world that they've built already is massive.
Yeah.
And then the complexity of the character they've presented is actually a lot richer than I think they understood. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, there's a moment, I think it's called Electric Requiem. Yeah. It's right near the end, which originally was supposed to be an instrumental only. And then they added in the talking points in the singing. And the last lines of it is, he's the protagonist, what's his name again? Is
Nikki.
Nikki is talking about his, this is a spoiler alert, his deceased love interest.
Yes.
And she was a nun who used to be a prostitute. So there's an interesting biblical connection. But he speaks of her now that she's gone, he says, who will clean my sin? Who will wash my sins? Who will clean my room? Who will fix my meals? Who will be my friend? The moment they said that, they made this far too complicated for them to end it as soon as they did conceptually.
Right.
The depths of those statements are huge. It's not just, my girlfriend's dead. This person I love is dead. He's talking about massive existential things that could be explored. And he's also talking about, in the story, he also talks about he doesn't know if he's the one that killed her or not.
Yeah.
Like the whole stuff with memory too. It's so rich. You need David Fincher's Memento kind of complexity and understanding to really make that third act stronger. So The Needle Lies, with its tempo coming out of the mood of Sweet Sister Mary, is to me is like the weakest moment of what is there.
Well, that song serves as his epiphany, right?
Which song?
The Needle Lies.
Yes.
Right. And beyond communicating that idea, and depending upon where in this discussion or perhaps the aftercast we may break down some of this stuff a little more.
Oh, I think
deeper.
we will. Yeah. Plus, there's a really great story I have about cassettes.
That's awesome. we at the same time that they were, they've my understanding of how they did this album is that they've got a blackboard, a whiteboard, and that they've laid it out on the whiteboard to get to the point of Sweet Sister Mary, right? And which was by all accounts the hardest track for them to finish, because in some ways it's the end of that big narrative story that they're telling that then leads into the second part of the album. At the same time that they were given the freedom to kind of tell that big story, there was the pressure on the band, and they felt it themselves to have some songs that worked outside of the narrative.
Yeah.
So
they needed their singles.
And although there are some very, very strong songs, and in some ways I'd argue stronger on the first side for the stuff
Revolution
I'm interested
Calling?
in. Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Great song.
Side 2, or the second act, the songs on there, part of we'll call it the maybe the ephemeral connection to the story and the story not pursued, is that these are meant to be able to be digested or seen as something a little more universal, right?
Yeah.
And so they're so there's if you look at them that way
and think about the music industry,
and they're about love and they're less specific and more generalized in some of the lyrical content and just in just you can interpret them
right.
Like if you didn't know the story, you could hear Eyes of a Stranger, or you could hear I Don't Believe in Love, and it would stand on its own as
which is what they did. Those are the two singles, as far as I remember.
They were, yeah. And again, like for me, I actually had less interest in those songs as singles, and much more interest in what I heard in the first half. But I understand that, I understand of that, why that second side might look this way. From a creative standpoint as well, I see that the second side also didn't have the same, for the band, connection to the narrative, and so that it almost feels to me that they wrote them as in pieces, as a specific piece, without really understanding where they fit in the narrative themselves.
You mean those last few tunes?
Yeah,
that's interesting, because I would be a little bit more ambiguous about that, just because I think that those songs are very... I get what you're saying, and I agree with you. And it's also a brilliant idea in marketing that they be at the end of the album, because then people, when they buy the album, they would be more compelled to go through the rest of the album to get to them, especially if you have a cassette. You have to either fast forward or rewind and that. But I think that there is definitely some truth to what you're saying about those songs. But I think that those songs to me also evoke more.
Right.
They direct me to greater depth of this character.
Right. And if I imagine your 15-year-old listening experience with this, that you would have spent more time integrating those into your understanding of the whole. So I think you would have gone on a deeper journey with these tracks and found your connection to the...
You mean when I was 15?
Yeah.
When I was 15, I just thought this was great. So what do you mean? I don't know. I don't think I understand what you mean.
Well, I like... So my experience on these latter tracks is especially is I can basically go through each track and say, this is the Iron Maiden ripoff. This is the Dokken ripoff. This is the Scorpions ripoff, and literally. And
I actually, maybe my 15-year-old self is going to argue that.
Right.
I don't think they're ripoffs.
Well,
I wouldn't put it that way.
Sure, but I think because you spent the time with it, right? at 15. And so that's what I mean by you did the work to integrate it into the whole.
So it stands on its own.
So it's part of the whole. Whereas I came at it sort of post,
right.
And I'm saying, why is this the way it is? Did they run out of steam? Are these are these piecemeal kind of, we got to get some hits on here? And is that why we have these stylistic variation? You mentioned something just earlier in this discussion where you talked about how you like the change, that suddenly the change in mood and the change in stuff, and it does make me reconsider the intentionality of this change. You know, that it was an intentional element. Is something more intentional than I'm giving him credit for. Not
I think I like
prepared
what,
to
right. I like what you're opening up here, because what you said about the ripoffs. So when I was 15, you're right. I wouldn't have been able to do that. I didn't know that much about music, and we also, back in the day, like we were talking about Much Music, it was hard to get access to a lot of stuff. Like now, it just spills out of your phone.
Right.
So at that time, when I bought my cassette, it was also probably the last $15 I had at the time.
Right.
So
and you're in the beginning of, you're still in the early stages of your music collecting.
I've been playing guitar for like 2 years, and then there's also what I was saying about how I was kind of on my own with the album and my appreciation for it. So I appreciate what you're saying about that. But one thing I think about this album is that for whatever the reasons are, the outcome of this album is that I think they achieve things with these styles of playing that some of those bands you mentioned never even came close to. So one thing, when I was listening to the guitar parts and spending some time with them, it's not always the case in the songs, but there's a strong presence of a style of playing that was pretty much established by Eddie Van Halen, was picked up by Randy Rhoads, and it went into that hard rock area, and it's the use of a pedal tone. So you have, on the guitar, you've got 6 strings. It's a very chordal instrument. And a pedal tone is a note that keeps being heard in the lower register while there's harmonic changes over top.
Yeah.
This is a very common guitar riffing device of rock, hard rock, especially in the 80s. And I'm pretty sure that Eddie Van Halen was really the one who kind of set that up. Randy Rhoads with Ozzy Osbourne kind of pursued that particular area a little bit more, I think, in his own way. And then people like George Lynch, Warren DeMartini, and then later Jakey Lee, and these guitar players used it. And none of them used it in what we were talking about in this kind of operatic symphonic scale, where when you look at the song that I first gravitated towards was Eyes of a Stranger, there's some very interesting chordal choices of thirds and fourths in that song that make it sound very evocative in a way that I don't think anyone else had really touched on. Now, why that happened or how that happened, I have no idea.
Right.
But when I think about I Don't Believe in Love, which is the other single we talked about, or the guitar writing in Sweet Sister Mary that was paired with orchestration, the use of the pedal point and changing harmonies, you can find that in other places. But they put it in this concept album format that it isn't like 2112. But when I heard 2112, the first thing I was thinking is I didn't know you could do that. And that's what a lot of people I've heard say about their first listen to 2112. I've never heard a power trio do this. So in the same respect, we've got Iron Maiden's already established, already doing its thing with its double guitars. But they didn't do this. And there's it's almost like, and I know it, and I might be speaking a little bit of in an abstract way, because it's almost like this way of creating guitar parts and putting hard rock together had been established. It's just that they just turned the object of it just a little bit. So there's these other facets that came to light. And I think that this album, I'm not 100% sure about this. I'd love to hear from anyone if they have an opinion on it. I think that this album legitimized not only prog sort of metal, but it legitimized prog concept albums, prog metal concept albums. I think it did more than just, stand out for Queensrÿche. I think that they actually made a very distinct impact with this album.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But like I said, I haven't totally researched the heck out of it.
Well, Portnoy, talks about how
drummer from Dream Theater,
how influential this album and this band was to their existence. And so I would have to give them that for sure. In my mind, I'm building this narrative now, especially as we've started to talk about this, is that this band that I talked about that was kind of a bit of a nothing burger, in their first couple of albums, in the sense that
full meal deal nothing burger.
They had the capabilities, but they hadn't found an identity, hadn't achieved something yet.
Right, yeah.
They hadn't even necessarily identified as a band properly. No,
they were still having that issue. Yeah,
they weren't a band of brothers, with a united.
Even in the end, they weren't a band of brothers.
Well,
breakups, breakup,
and I think we definitely will touch on that as well a little bit. But something about this album and something about what sort of congealed for them, both artistically, personally, and professionally. I mean, this was kind of it, right? Like, you don't get. Is this their third album?
I think technically, yes.
Yeah. Like
they had. I think the album before it was called Warning.
Yeah.
And that song Warning was another single that they had. And I think they had a previous album that was more like an EP.
Yeah,
it was kind of a demo-ish kind of situation.
Yeah, and Warning's that video that I was talking about. Warning.
Yeah, that's it.
Wasn't my thing.
Me neither.
Yeah,
me neither.
But they weren't going to get another chance. In some ways they were like Rush with 2112, right? Like they were either going to do it, right, or they weren't.
Right.
At this stage in their career, this is it. You've had a bit of a run, and we're going to give you enough rope here. But had they put out something bad or something derivative, this would have been it. So just the stakes being so high and for all of them in very interesting ways, brought them together and kept them able to pull this off as an album. I find that story there would be really interesting to kind of get deeper into the psychology of that. Of how this album came together, what had to happen or what aligned within them and their personalities, which we know are divergent already, from
well, yeah, I mean,
like how did convergence happen for them? How do they conceptualize that?
Well, we could be talking about it phenomenologically and just say, well, it wasn't really about any of them. It was about all the other things we can't talk about.
Right. Which is interesting.
But I think that the other thing that makes this album have the potency that it had is kind of like in the realm of when Yes was reviewed for, I can't remember what album it was. Some reviewer very tongue-in-cheekedly said, "What are they going to do next? Set the Bible?"
Right.
And John Anderson's response to that was, "Yeah, okay."
Yeah.
And I think that there is a bravado that comes off of this album. And I think as my 15-year-old self and me today, I still hear it in the album. And I think it isn't because of one particular element. Like, I would even argue that Eddie Jackson's little bass run moments are inspired. They're great.
Yeah.
They just pop, and they just do these nice little connective moments. Scott Rockenfeld's playing is great. He, as far as I'm concerned, I feel that he might be the drummer that made a whole bunch of other drummers after, including Portnoy, think that it is possible to be a human metronome.
Okay.
Like, more so than like Neil Peart didn't. I don't think Neil Peart really conveyed that, because what I love about Neil Peart is that it's so easy not to understand how good he was.
Right.
Like, really, it's very easy not to understand. I saw Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson playing with Danny Carey a couple of years ago, and they did YYZ.
Yeah.
And I, even seeing that at this one, I thought, oh, I don't even get it. I didn't really get it. And so the playing on this album, like the fact that the snare drum sounds like gunshots. Every time you hear that snare, it has the potency of a gunshot.
Right.
The whole album has this halo that happens with its formation that I think affected. I guess I'm trying to add to the ambiguity of how did these things happen. I mean, it was recorded. Part of it was recorded in the studio.
Right. Yeah.
What did that do?
Yeah. Le Studio, the famed Canadian studio in Quebec, out in this beautiful woods that you'll have seen in the Rush studio videos for moving pictures, where they're
Tom Sawyer, Vital Signs.
Or Tom Sawyer and
Vitals. But they also did Vitals. Didn't they record Vital
They
Signs?
might have recorded it there, but they didn't do video there.
Didn't they?
Vital Signs is no.
I thought they did.
Like they didn't shoot video. I don't remember seeing performance.
Okay.
But it doesn't really matter.
It matters. I just don't remember.
Yeah. But also April Wine recorded the whatever the big album with
I can't remember either.
Yeah,
I was not an April Wine enthusiast.
No, but I bring them up because I just read something about Le Studio and them because their lead singer has just passed. So that marks
and
us
Le
in
Studio ended under weird circumstances, but that's a whole other thing.
But very cool. But you bring up something that I think we can go into, but at least we should note even here in the conversation is that although we're talking about this band and these guys putting a project together, to put this album together and the people involved in helping this band put this project
Pamela
together,
Moore.
involved engineers and producers and a whole team of people catering that helped sustain focus and contributed elements to this so if you're imagining 5 guys in a room that lock the door and walk out with a concept album, there's like another 50 guys in the room with them,
and then, like I said, there's Pamela Moore, who does the role of Sweet Sister Mary, and she sings those parts. And then there's Michael Kamen and those players and the choral choir, who's, I'm afraid I can't remember what choir it was. Yeah, there's all these elements that come together, and beautifully we go on in awe and wonder of them.
So sometimes when we're talking about albums like this, we can either overemphasize or underemphasize the role of the artist in the album, and do the same thing to the producers and production team, and this is an interesting one because it seems to have this we don't talk about this necessarily as where we've deified a single individual, as in like sometimes people will talk about a Pink Floyd album, and they'll put all their weight behind Roger Waters, right? But we also don't, and we don't ignore the contributions of the producer and the other members of the team that helped this album come to fruition. So it's really got a we don't have necessarily a really sellable story for that, we've got one that's more realistic. This is a work that a body of people put together, and lots of things had to congeal for them in different ways on the artistic side, the personal side, the business side, the team side to come to put this album together. And I think so the celebration of it is for what it is wonderful. Like that's how this kind of thing comes out. And I just note that we don't have that narrative that we would take to the paper, the marketing material that would sell this album as the way you would normally, that you would try and sell it, like that its origin story is much more real than it is sensational. That maybe is a better way to put it. So,
right.
So we don't have a sensational origin story for this. We've got
but we do have these elements that we can explore that will take us into a multiplicity of other possibilities. Like even the idea that this was partially influenced by the separatist party in Quebec, the separatists in Quebec. That in itself.
Yeah, and I look forward to talking about that a bit in the Aftercast as well. So,
it is that time, isn't it?
Yeah. So, I mean, like all things, we barely started the discussion, and
but it continues.
It does continue
in our Aftercast, which we have on our Patreon page.
Yeah,
and we're also really keen to hear from anyone about what their thoughts or experience are with this album. And if you want to hear more about where stuff is going to go in this conversation, check out the Aftercast. Yeah,
check out the Aftercast. And a couple of quick things to let people know about too is that the back catalog of the podcasts are also available now on YouTube channel.
Yes, they are.
And this one will also make its way there. And that's a place that you can also contact us on. So aside from our Gmail address, sonicventurespodcast@gmail.com, we are accessible through social media, our Instagram account, and as well as our Twitter account, I would assume, and now our new YouTube account.
Yeah.
So feel free to reach out or participate in the podcast any way you would like to.
Yeah, we love to hear people's thoughts and their experiences, and that's really been really great. We've actually been getting people's, not just so much an opinion, but a story and an anecdote.
We've had some
really nice stuff.
Yeah, we've had some amazing contributions to the discussion by people out in the listening community, and that have shared some remarkable things with us that we're still digesting and processing.
Oh yeah.
And so love to hear from people because we love music, right?
Yeah,
and we love
to talk about it, even though we'll never get to the end of it.
There we go. I think time's up.
Always a pleasure, Rob.
Thanks, Joël.